Hi friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. My name is Jennifer, and as you can see, today we're in my kitchen again, and we are going to be making a really delicious sourdough recipe today. We're going to be making a simple sourdough focaccia bread, which is really delicious and very customizable depending on what toppings you'd like on it. So this is, as I said, this is a really easy sourdough recipe. This is going to be using an active sourdough starter, so we aren't going to be using any other yeast. It's going to be leavened completely with our sourdough starter. So I'm just going to go through step by step with you. It's going to be so easy, and I am going to go ahead and in the description, I'm going to link the blog where I found this recipe. I definitely recommend that you check out her blog and definitely try this recipe. I'm also going to type out all of the ingredients for you so that you don't have to worry about writing everything down as we go, so that you can just refer back to the description and you can find all of the information there. So let's get started. All right, so let's get started making our sourdough focaccia bread. Here I have laid out all the ingredients that we're going to need for our bread. I have some all-purpose white flour. I have some whole wheat bread flour. You can certainly use all of one of these, or you could use a combination like I am. It just really comes down to your preference. We have some salt here. We're going to need olive oil. We are going to need some room temperature water, and of course our sourdough starter as well, which I have in this jar here. So you're also going to need a kitchen scale like this. This is just a really simple, cheap scale, and it does the trick for this. So a lot of times with bread, with baking recipes, you'll find that you measure it in grams rather than volume measurements, and that really just makes it a little more precise, and I actually find it quite a bit easier to work with. So we're going to go ahead and turn on our scale. I'm going to add our bowl, and we're going to zero that out because we don't want the weight of our bowl in there. So the first ingredient we're going to start with is our sourdough starter. I am going to carefully pour in 160 grams of sourdough starter here. Let's see. And so you want this to be an active fed starter. So I fed this starter last night. You don't want to use your discard for this recipe because this recipe is relying entirely on the sourdough starter for leavening. We don't have any yeast or any other leavening agents in this recipe. So you want to make sure your sourdough starter is nice and active and bubbly. So I'm going to go ahead and hit tare on our scale. We'll zero it out. The next ingredient that we're going to add is our flour. So we need 450 grams total of flour. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to use 400 grams of this white flour, and I'm going to use about 50 grams of the whole wheat. So let's go ahead and start adding our white flour nice and slowly. Here, I don't know, I'll move this up here so I think you can see it a little better. All right, so we're at about 311 right now. So if I do about 400 grams of this white flour, then this is just going to taste like white bread. It won't really taste like wheat bread, but my kids will be getting the nutrition, at least some of the nutrition from whole wheat bread. So now we're just going to keep adding this until we get up to 450 total grams of flour. And there we go, 450 exactly. So we're going to add 9 grams of salt. You can use really any salt that you like to bake with in this recipe. I'm using kosher salt here. Sometimes I use sea salt, Himalayan pink salt, just kind of whatever I happen to have on hand will work in this. So you just want to, I forgot to zero out my scale. So I'm going to go to 459 because I have my 450 grams of flour in here, and that's getting added into my salt. But it's definitely easier if you remember to zero out your scale between each ingredient. Okay, 459. So we're going to go ahead and zero that out right away so I don't forget. We also need a tablespoon of olive oil. This is the one ingredient that is measured by volume in this recipe. So we're just going to add a tablespoon of olive oil to this. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is we need to add our room temperature water. Now I'm using water from my faucet because I have a well. If you have chlorinated city water, you're going to want to either use a different source of water, or I know some people let their water sit at room temperature overnight, and that allows the chlorine to evaporate. You don't really want chlorine in a sourdough recipe. So I'm just going to go ahead and use water straight from my faucet because this water is safe to use. So you're going to want, depending on the humidity level in your house, you're going to want between 350 to 400 grams of water. I usually find that if I do right in the middle, about 375, that seems to work well for me. But what you can always do is just start with the lower end of the range, about 350, and then see if your dough seems like you need more. You can just add a little bit more slowly as you go. So I'm just going to add this slowly till we get to 375, pretty close. Oh, 377. All right, I went over by just a hair, but that will be fine in this recipe. So now we're just going to go ahead and mix all this up. You don't need to worry about, as you can see, you don't need to worry about having a stand mixer. You don't need to worry about kneading with this bread. This is just so simple. We just add our ingredients to the bowl. We're going to stir it up. And then as you'll see in our next step, we're going to do a series of what are called stretches and folds. And that is what is going to allow our bread to really develop its structure, just to allow the gluten to develop. But super simple, no kneading required. So as you can see here, this is a super wet dough. See that? You can see how I can easily mix it. It's really wet. So that's what we want for this recipe. Focaccia dough is going to be a little bit wetter than your average sourdough bread recipe. And your average sourdough recipe is probably a little bit wetter than your regular bread recipe. So it's going to be pretty wet, but don't worry, that is how it's supposed to be. And a bonus, with focaccia bread, there is no shaping involved, so we don't have to worry about that step. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and cover up this dough. So this is going to rise for a total of 4 hours before going in the refrigerator overnight. But what we're going to do for the first 2 hours of that rise time, we are going to be doing our stretches and folds. So you're going to do those about every 30 minutes during the first 2 hours. So basically you'll do 4 sets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this sit for half an hour. I'll meet you back here in half an hour and I'll show you the first set of stretches and folds. All right, I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so it's been half an hour. We're back here with our dough. We're ready to do our first set of stretches and folds. So we're going to open this up and take a look. All right, so it still looks pretty wet. It still looks pretty shapeless, but we're going to go ahead and change that. So what you're going to do, basically, you're going to take your hand and kind of scrape the dough off the sides of the bowl. You're going to grab the dough and pull it into the middle. You're going to go all the way around. This is going to be pretty wet and sticky, but what we're doing when we do this is we're creating structure. And as you do this, you'll notice with each stretch and fold, the dough has a little more structure and it gets a little bit easier. It'll be a little bit less sticky. So I just kind of spin the bowl around as I go. That's what's easiest to me. I'll probably go around the dough maybe 2 or 3 times until it starts to feel, after you do it a few times, you'll notice just a little bit of resistance, like your dough has a little bit of structure to it. So I just kind of go around and do that a few times. So you can see it's starting to get just a little bit of structure. So we're going to go ahead and cover this back up, and then you're going to do this again in a half hour, in an hour, and in an hour and a half. So basically 4 times you're going to do this same set of stretches and folds. It'll be the same each time. You should notice with each set that your dough feels a little bit stronger. It has a little more structure to it. That's because we're creating structure with our stretches and folds. This is kind of the alternative to kneading, what we're doing here. So after your 4th set of stretches and folds, you're going to let it rest at room temperature for another 2 hours. So it'll have a total rest time of 4 hours. And then you're going to go ahead and put it in a pan and stick it in the fridge. So I will meet you back here when it's time to stick it in the pan, and we will go over that. Until then, have fun with your stretches and folds, and I will see you soon. All right, so our bread has finished its 4-hour ferment, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to get it into our pan, and then we're going to stick it in the fridge overnight so that it can finish proofing overnight. So the first thing we're going to want to do, you're going to want some kind of big pan like this. I have a 9x13 glass pan here. You want a big baking dish so that it can really spread out. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil down in the pan here because we're going to want to grease this. Now I'm going to spread it all around, up the sides too. You want to be pretty generous with this so that our bread doesn't stick at all. And then the edges will get a little bit of olive oil on them, get nice and crusty while they cook. It's really delicious. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and wash this oil off my hands and I will be right back. Okay, so we've got our pan well greased. Let's take a look at our bread dough and see how that looks. So you can see it looks nice and smooth. It's still pretty wet and loose. That's okay. That's what we want for focaccia. So we're just kind of going to pour this into the pan. I'm just going to take my hand, just kind of scrape all the sides so that it releases off the sides. And we're just going to pour it right into the middle of our pan. And thankfully, we do not have to shape this dough because this would be a pretty wet dough. It would be pretty sticky and tricky to shape. So now we have this here. I'm going to get my hands wet. You definitely want wet hands to spread this out because if you try to use dry hands, it's going to stick all over you. So I'm just going to get my fingers wet and then we'll spread this right out. Okay, so with wet fingers, you're just going to kind of gently stretch and pull it out to the sides. Don't be too rough with it. It will kind of, as it sits, it will kind of expand a little more. So if you don't get it all the way out, that's okay. Sourdough can be a little bit tricky. It kind of tries to resist stretching out sometimes. But we just want to get it stretched out as much as we can. Let's see. See how the olive oil is pooling in the corners there? That's going to make for some delicious crust on the edges of our bread. Just going to make sure it's pretty evenly spread out. We don't want one end to be thicker than the other. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It should spread out the rest of the way as it sits overnight. So you can see, there it is. I'm going to wash my hands again. I'm going to pop the lid on this and then we're going to get it in our fridge overnight and I will meet you back here tomorrow morning to do the final touches on our bread, bake it, and we will finally get to try it. All right, I will see you tomorrow morning. Hi guys, it's the next day. So I've gone ahead and pulled our bread out of the oven. So I'm going to just show you guys what it looks like after a night in the refrigerator. I'm just gonna pan you down here so that you can see our dough. Then we'll open this up and see what it looks like inside. So as you can see, it's kind of spread out a little bit and smoothed out just to reach to the sides of the pan. We have a little bit of olive oil pooling in the edges. That's good, that's fine. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead, this is cold from the refrigerator. So we are gonna go ahead and let this sit at room temperature for about 2 hours just to come up to room temperature and to start to rise a little bit. We want it to basically double in size before we go ahead and throw it in the oven. So I'm gonna let this sit and I will meet you back here in about 2 hours. Hi guys, we're back. Our bread's been rising for about 2 hours, so it's time to check on it and take a look. As you can see, I've got my oven preheating. We're gonna preheat it up to 450 degrees, and that will preheat while we go ahead and put some nice toppings on our focaccia bread. So first, let's open it up and let's take a look at what our bread looks like after rising. I'm just gonna pan you down so you can see the bread there. There we go. All right, let's take a look. Okay, so you can see it looks nice and risen. It looks puffier. You can see it's going farther up the side of the pan. It's got some nice big bubbles in it. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to drizzle the top of our bread with a little bit of olive oil. So I'll try to stick my finger in there so it doesn't come out too fast. And then I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil to my hands because what we are going to do is we are going to basically, we're going to stick our fingers into this dough and make dents all over it. So see how nice and dented that looks? I'm actually going to add a couple more. Now, I am going to go ahead and wash my hands and I will be right back. All right, I've got nice clean hands now, so we're ready to get working topping our bread. Now, you could certainly bake your bread just like this if you want plain focaccia. I like to add some toppings to make it a little more interesting, a little more exciting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sprinkle some, and there's our oven preheated. You want to sprinkle a little bit of coarse salt over the top. You could use a coarse sea salt. I have a kosher salt here. Now you'll see when I'm topping this bread, I have one child who likes things pretty simple and plain. So I'm going to leave a corner of this bread alone and not put any toppings except salt and olive oil on it. But we'll add some toppings and get the rest of it nice and fancy. So today what we're going to be using to top this bread with is some dehydrated cherry tomatoes that I have dehydrated from last year's garden, and we're going to be using some pesto. Now you could top this bread, you can get creative. There's lots of ways you could top it. It would be great if you put like maybe some caramelized onions and some rosemary sprigs on top. That would be delicious. You could put some cheese on top, pretty much just any topping that you can think of that would go on a focaccia bread would be really good. Lots of other herbs, some vegetables would be good. So now you can see we have our, these are dehydrated tomatoes, dehydrated cherry tomatoes from last summer. So what you're gonna wanna do if you're using a topping like this, you wanna push it down into these crevices here like this. Because if you don't, if it just floats on top, it's most likely going to burn. And we don't want those burned. So we're gonna push them into the bread. And usually I end up having a couple of these kind of work their way to the top and burn anyway. But the more of them that we can get to be nice and delicious and not burned, the better. So I'm just gonna go ahead and poke quite a few of these in. If the olive oil fills in after them, that's even better. Now I've made this with rosemary and caramelized onions, as I mentioned. I think that the most popular flavor in my house is what I'm making today, which is tomato and pesto. My son, as I mentioned, no matter what flavor I make, I always leave his corner plain because he likes things pretty simple. You want to just go ahead and we'll keep poking these in here. And you can make this as fancy or as simple as you want. But look at these big bubbles here. And remember, this only used sourdough. We don't have any yeast in this. So this is just leavened with only sourdough starter. So it can show you how strong and powerful sourdough can be. And actually, I noticed back at the beginning of COVID, I don't know if, depending on your area, I don't know if you noticed that there was a pretty serious yeast shortage. I couldn't get yeast for a while, for a few months. And I mean, I bake, I'm not like a sourdough purist. I bake a lot of sourdough, but I bake other bread too. I use yeast. I use sourdough and yeast combination. Anyway, I couldn't find yeast in the store for probably a couple months. And so during those couple months, I was especially grateful to have a sourdough starter at home because I could still make bread. I could still make all kinds of things. Pizza dough rolls, hamburger buns, all kinds of things. Pretty much anything you can do with yeast, for the most part, you can do with a sourdough starter also. And so, while yeast is great, and I do use yeast pretty often, there's something to be said for the sustainability of a sourdough starter. All right, so we've used up all of our tomatoes. These were our last tomatoes from last year's garden. So now I am looking forward even more to my harvest this year. So now we're going to use some pesto. Right here I just have store-bought pesto. You could definitely use homemade pesto. That would make this even better. So I plan to make this recipe in the summer when I have lots of fresh basil and pesto. So you can see I'm kind of just putting some dollops on the bread here and there. Oh, that was kind of a big one. I'm going to spread that one out a little bit. And this hasn't even started baking yet, and it already smells amazing. So let's see. I like to make sure every part is evenly topped so that every piece is equally good. I think we need a little bit more on the edge here. All right, that looks good. So you can see the tomatoes are pretty much hiding inside the dimples in the bread, and we've got the pesto pretty evenly distributed. So now we're gonna go ahead and pop this in our 450-degree oven for about 25 minutes. What I usually do with any recipe is I set the timer for a few minutes shorter than what the recipe calls for. So I'm gonna set my timer for 20 minutes, and I will come back and check on it then. So when this is ready to pull out of the oven, I will bring you back and I will show you how it looks. All right, I'll see you in just a few minutes. Okay, it's been 20 minutes. Our timer just went off. So I'm gonna check on the bread. Oh, yeah, that is definitely ready to come out. Look at that. Look at that deliciousness. You can see all those bubbles turn nice golden brown. And I see 2 tomatoes that popped up to the top and got burned. But most of them are hidden down inside the bread, and it's going to be delicious. So I'm going to let this cool down a little bit. Unlike regular sourdough bread or even regular loaf bread, you don't have to let this cool down completely to room temperature in order to be able to enjoy it. but obviously we're going to cool it down enough that we don't burn our mouths, but it smells amazing. So I definitely hope that you will make this recipe. I'm going to include a link to the recipe in the description, and I'm going to also write out all the ingredients for you. So I hope that you will try this recipe and see just how easy sourdough bread can be. So thank you for baking with me today. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I will see you next time. Bye.